8. Okay, chapter 8 is open. Okay, so we're now switching everything. We are taking everything we talked about from chapter 2 when we discussed demand, and now we're moving away from it. So let's just back up and talk a little bit about what we've done so far. Chapter 1, we kind of just introduced the subject of what managerial economics is and some of the things we're going to be covering. In chapter 2, we talked about supply and demand for the most part and talked about markets. Chapter 3, we talked about marginal analysis and why that's important. Chapter 4, we discussed estimation. Basically, we discussed running regressions. Chapter 5 we skipped, but Chapter 5 is really based on consumer activity. It's kind of the theory of the consumer. And once again, one of the reasons we skipped that was because it gets very theoretical into utility curves and so on and so forth. But I can really simplistically explain the chapter to you. Consumers are out there to maximize their utility, which is their happiness, but they're held back by certain things like income. Chapter 6 was on demand elasticity, and that really answered the question, if I increase my price, what is going to happen to my quantity demanded for my product? Or as from a consumer's perspective, when price increases, what am I going to do? Am I going to buy more or less of that? Chapter 7 just went into how we could actually finalize this whole theory of demand and estimate it. We're done now with the consumer part, okay? So now we switch the whole mindset of being shoppers into become more in thinking of ourselves as producers. Okay. Now I have to be honest with you. These next 2 chapters, and like I said, we're going to skip a little bit of chapter 9. Get somewhat theoretical. Okay. So there's going to be parts that we'll get into, and some parts we'll skip through. But basically, you can think of Chapter 8 as the beginning of us getting into supply. Okay. Let's start out the chapter by just saying that costs are important too, and sometimes they're overlooked. A lot of firms focus mainly in on revenues, and revenues are driven by what? Demand, right? Supply is important too, and of course you want to be efficient in your costs, right? So sometimes that's overlooked. It's thought that globalization has made productive efficiency more important. As the recessions came about, I think we all know that businesses cut back in a variety of ways, whether it be cutting back on labor, which is not good. Maybe sometimes they do make good adjustments, though, like they cut back on electricity usage, try to be more efficient in certain ways, certain costs. But we all know that became more apparent right after the most recent recession. And productive decisions are made in 2 different time frames. Now this is the part that we talked a little bit about macro. It's coming back up again. The short run, we're going to deal with this today, and the long run we'll deal with in chapter 9. Okay? So the short run and long run come back. And believe it or not, the reason I think that this is kind of good to come back now is, I don't know if you remember, the short run and long run for macro, we kind of said it's really unanswered what they are. When does the other one begin? Well, the cool thing about this chapter is that kind of starts to get answered here. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so what are the basic concepts of production theory? Production theory is you can use it. Production theory is based upon an equation that we covered in chapter 1, which specified that output, which you could symbolize as Q, is a function of L for land, L for labor, K for capital, and E for entrepreneurship. The 4 major resources that we discussed in chapter 1, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, are all involved in producing anything. output of desks, output of buildings, whatever. So production theory states that the maximum amount of output that can be produced from any specified set of inputs given existing technology. So that's our production function. So that's the production function, once again, is that underlying equation that we talked about in chapter 1. Q equals function of, meaning F parentheses, LLKE, standing for land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Technical efficiency is achieved when the maximum amount of output is produced with a given combination of inputs. And economic efficiency is achieved when the firm is producing a given output at the lowest possible total cost. That gets back to optimization, marginal benefit equaling marginal cost. Basic concepts of production theory. Inputs are going to be considered variable or fixed depending on how readily their usage can be changed. A variable input would be an input for which the level of usage may be changed quite readily, and of course a fixed input then would be a situation in which an input for which the level of usage cannot be readily changed, and which must be paid even if no output is produced. So think of a variable input as something like labor. So we talked about there's 4 major inputs: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Let's just use labor. Some might say that you can easily, variably switch your labor, right? You can fire people or you can hire people. In other words, you can do that fairly quickly. Whereas something like capital, particularly, when you think of capital, think of like a building like this. Is this easy to just add a building like this? No, it would take a long period of time to do that. So I'm going to argue going forward, and the text is going to argue that kind of lump the capital input in with the fixed input, and kind of lump the labor input in with the variable input for now. Okay, so moving on, the short run is a situation in which one input is fixed. What do you think that means? Anyone? Very good. So you can't really change it. You can't change whatever the level is that you may have. So for example, let's say that our capital is fixed, meaning we have one building, okay? But you want to produce as much as you can. So you may have to hire more labor. That's your variable input. So all changes in output would be achieved by changing the usage of variable inputs. In the long run, however, all inputs are variable. So there you go. When we talked about short run and the long run, that's what the difference between the two are. The long run is a situation in which all inputs are variable. Output is changed by varying the usage of all inputs. So that's what we were discussing in macro. We never really got into why it's exactly different. And I know this still doesn't completely answer it, but it does theoretically. And you may now see why there's a huge debate between those different versions of macroeconomists, because no one knows precisely when all inputs become variable. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's something similar. Actually it's very similar. I mean, at the end of the day, the short run is basically saying. I mean, the way the text is going to describe it, it's labor. You can hire and fire people. You know, put on your producer hat. All of a sudden, you can do that sort of thing. But in the short run, you can't add buildings. can't add plants. And I think generally when you talk about production with economics, it's good to think about production as a manufacturer. Because if you start thinking of it as services, it gets all convoluted and hard to understand. But if you think of it like I'm making desks, then you can envision, okay, well, I need a plant to make desks. And okay, I have one plant and I have 100 people working for me. In the short run, they're going to say you could hire more people, so maybe you could hire 120. Or maybe you could let some go, you could have 80 in the short run. In the long run, you could get another plant and have 200 people working for you. So, yeah, I think that what you're saying does make sense. It's kind of similar in some ways. So it might be based on the same theory. Okay, sunk costs. I think we talked about this before, but to reiterate what sunk costs are, they're payment for an input that once made cannot be recovered should the firm no longer wish to employ that input. This is not part of the economic cost of production, and therefore it should be ignored for decision-making purposes. I've said before, like ID cards, like, or it could be an example of a sunk cost, banners for a business, that sort of thing. The text also gets into what they call avoidable costs. These are input costs the firm can recover to or avoid paying should it no longer wish to employ that input. And they matter in decision making and should not be ignored. They basically are going to reflect the opportunity cost of resource use. So these are going to be important ones to keep in mind, the avoidable costs. Short run production. Okay, so here we're finally getting into this. In the short run, capital is fixed. Only changes in the variable labor input can change the level of output. The short run production function looks like this. Now let me explain this. So the little line above the K, that means it's fixed. Okay? So let's back this thing up. So here's your little line above your K. That means it's fixed. So your Q equals F of L and K. Let's start with that. That means that our output that we produce, we're producers right now. We want to produce some sort of thing, maybe desks. And our number of desks that we can produce is going to be based upon how many of us we have working on it, our labor, and how many buildings we have. Or you could even think of it differently if you want. You could think of it like how many buildings with a conveyor belt do we have, which help us create the desks, right? So what this is saying is the building with conveyor belt, that's fixed because it's the short run. The labor is not. And because of that, the production function actually gets reduced down to just being a function of labor in the short run. In the long run, that's not the case. It would be a function of capital and labor. But because the capital is fixed in the short run, it just becomes a function of labor. In other words, you can grow your workforce or shrink your workforce, and that will grow your output or shrink your output.
One thing that sometimes confuses me,
Yep.
kind of learning all this stuff, once you learn one thing and then you try to apply it to the next, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and I'll see that line and I'll say mean.
Mean?
When the mean of something is not even, we're not even talking about populations, but when I see that line over K, now it means something different.
No, that's actually a very good point, and I'm trying to think of why they equate the two. Okay, so good to bring up. No, it's a good thing to bring up. I would think that the reason that they tend to use the line over the K and they use the line like that over the mean is to say this is consistent. Think about it, a mean is going to be pretty consistent. So it's going to be, if there's 10 individuals and you're, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example here. I would think that that's the rationale behind why they're using it, is it's to a form of consistency, and with the K, it's saying it's going to stay at 1, so it's consistent. But I don't know why they do that. In all honesty, the terminology and the graphic that people use are honestly arbitrary. What was that?
I don't know.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
What did it sound
There
like?
was something outside, and then like the door or something shook or moved.
I hope that we're not locked out. For those of you at home following along, we just had a noise in our classroom and we don't know what it was. But let's move back to this so we can keep going. If somebody wants to check the door, feel free. Okay, so moving forward, unfortunately, there's going to be some curves coming. So that's where we're moving now. So let's talk about what the average product of labor is. Okay, so you can envision that if you have all these employees, they're trying to produce something. What do we want to know sometimes? We want to know how much is Bob producing? How much is Mary producing? What's our average production? Well, the average product of labor is going to tell you that. The marginal product of labor is going to tell you if I add one more worker, how much more desks am I going to get? Or how much more output am I going to get from adding that one additional person? When the average production is rising, the marginal production is greater than the average production. This stuff here, I have to be honest with you, the way they do this in the slides, it gets a little bit confusing. So sometimes it's just better to look at that part with a chart, as is it for this here. When the average product is falling, the marginal product is going to be less than the average product. And when the average product reaches its maximum, they will be equal. So let's talk about this though. The law of diminishing marginal product. As usage of a variable input increases, in this case it's labor, a point is going to be reached beyond which the marginal product decreases. So what does that actually mean? That means this. Let's say we're trying to create desks. We have a conveyor belt, and we have 20 people working on our conveyor belt to create the desks. At some point, you could keep adding labor and keep adding labor, but at some point, the marginal product would get lower. Meaning, let's say we have 50 people working. Let's lower that. Let's say we have 10 people working on a conveyor belt to make our desks. We add an 11th person. Marginal product increases a little bit. But at some point, that marginal product is going to start to lower. In fact, it might even turn negative eventually. Meaning, by the time we get to add the 21st person, he's actually causing havoc. By adding him, it actually creates a problem for the workforce. At some point, you can envision, why don't you have 1,000 people working on your conveyor belt? Is that really going to make more desks? No, honestly, by adding all those people, at some point, it actually becomes counterproductive to have that many people working on the conveyor belt. That's what the law of diminishing marginal product means. So let's go through here and talk about a little bit about how you would calculate each of these. The average product. You just take your output or your Q and you divide it by your number of labors. So 52 divided by 1 gives you 52. 112 divided by 2 gives you 56. 170 divided by 3, 56.7. And you can see here that you just keep doing that and doing that all the way down. And it keeps declining, right? The more you add, the lower the average product goes. Let's talk about the marginal product now. That's the change in Q over the change in L. So the change in Q from 0 to 52 is what? 52, right? And that's over L, which is 1. So our first one is 52. The change in Q over the change in L for the second would be 111 minus 52. I'm sorry, 112 minus 52 divided by, whatever that is, divided by 1, because 2 minus 1. So that comes out to 60. So the difference between 112 and 52 is 60. The difference between 2 and 1 is 1, so 60 divided by 1 is going to give you 60. Next one, difference between 170 and 112 is 58. Difference between 3 and 2 is 1, so it's 58. 58 over 1 is 58. Next one, 220 minus 170 is 50. 4 minus 3 is 1, so 50 over 1 is 50. You guys get the idea here? Okay. So you keep doing this, and eventually the point that we were just raising was at some point the marginal product goes negative. And that happens with, in this case, our 10th worker. So when we add that 10th worker, that guy is not adding any more production to our conveyor belt line. He's actually subtracting from it. So in this case, adding that 10th worker is really not good for our company, right? We're not getting anything out of it. In fact, we're actually losing product based on adding that individual. Okay, so here you have your total product curve. We showed you how to do that in the past. And below, you have your average product curve. And honestly, this is pretty simplistic. I know this seems a little bit weird how they all of a sudden they're going into the curves. But if you go back to that previous slide where we were looking at each of the, how you calculated them all out, and then they're just graphing them now, okay? And this is what the curves would look like if you did graph them. And you can see here that the marginal product curve is on the same axis as the average product curve. And it starts out with a quick increase, the marginal product curve does, and then there's a pretty sharp decrease after that. This is just another version of the same thing we just showed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that marginal product, where does that marginal product curve, that intersects the average product curve where? Just take a look at it. Right at its peak. See that? The marginal product curve intersects the average product curve right at its peak. So keep that in mind. Oh, and the other thing to keep in mind is the marginal product goes negative, or just starts to almost hit negative right at the exact point where total product is hitting its peak. See that? Look at total product where it hits its peak, and look at where marginal product is almost going into the negative territory. It's right on the 0 axis. See that? Okay, so that's what they were trying to tell you earlier in words, but it probably didn't make as much sense as seeing it in picture or graphically. Okay, so we're moving on to costs, and like I said, there's a lot of different curves in this chapter, and I apologize for that. I know that some of this stuff gets a little confusing, but just kind of go through it slowly, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more understandable. Okay, so total variable cost is the total amount paid for variable inputs, and it increases as output increases. Total fixed cost is the total amount paid for fixed inputs, and it does not vary with output. So the total cost is your total variable cost plus your total fixed cost. So let's take a step back. Why are they getting into all this now? Well, they're getting into this because we just talked about variable inputs, did we not? We talked about labor being the variable one, and we talked about capital being the fixed one, right? In our example of the short run. So now they're getting into the costs associated with these. So we're stating here once again that the total variable cost is the total amount paid for variable inputs. In our case, it would be labor. And total fixed cost is the total amount paid for fixed cost. In our case, it would be capital. Total cost is just adding the two together. So let's do some math here. We have our total variable costs. You can see that if they are given at 4,000, 6,000, 9,000, 14,000, 22,000, and 34,000, our total cost is simply adding the two numbers together. So 6,000 plus 0 is 6,000, 6,000 plus 4,000 is 10,000, and so on. It's pretty simplistic. Okay. And here you have your cost curves. You can see the total variable cost is increasing as you increase your output. Total fixed cost, on the other hand, stays the same no matter what your output is. So it's really demonstrating this, in a sense, graphically. So the key here, though, is your total cost. Look at the total cost. The total cost is varying only based on one thing, and that is the variable cost. All right? So in other words, your total cost is only varying based on your changes in your variable cost. Why is that? It is because your fixed cost does not change. Okay? So that's why you see the line, the total cost line, moving almost in tandem with the total variable cost line. All right, now they get into a little bit of averages. You could take your total variable cost and divide it by your output. You'd get your average variable cost. If you wanted to get your average fixed cost, you take your total fixed cost and you just divide that by your output, and you get your average fixed cost. Your average total cost can be obtained in two different ways. You can either take your total cost. What I would do is take my total cost and divide it by my output, just like I did for all the other ones. Alternatively, you could take your average variable cost plus your average fixed cost, and that would give you your average total cost. Okay? So I know there's a lot of equations in this chapter, but you can kind of periodically go back and check them out on your own. Short-run marginal cost is another curve that is important to note. So the short-run marginal cost measures the rate of change in total cost as output varies. And we mentioned before, whenever we get into marginal, we're talking about the next unit change, right? And in this case, they show you here that short-run marginal cost is equal to the change in total cost over the change in output. But I just mentioned to you that total variable cost is the only thing that's changing. So this can be simplified into the change in total variable cost over the change in quantity or output, because it's the exact same. Remember, once again, the only thing involved in total cost. Total cost has fixed cost and variable costs. That's what makes up total cost. But the only thing that's changing in total cost is the variable cost. And therefore, the fixed cost doesn't change. Therefore, it doesn't really matter. And they're showing you that graphically here in the sense that the change in total cost is going to be identical to the change in variable cost. So our total fixed cost divided by our quantity, I believe our total fixed cost was 600. That divided by 100 would give you 60. And you could go through your total fixed costs and divide them by your output, and you would get these numbers here. Your average variable cost was, I believe, 400. You divide that by 100 in your quantity, you get 40. And you could calculate the rest out as well. To get your average total cost, you're simply going to either add the two, or you could take your total cost and divide it by your output. In this case, just add the two together. 60 and 40 gives you 100. 30 and 30, 60, and so on. So 30 and 20 would give you 50, and 15 and 35, 50, so on. Okay, so the short-run marginal cost is the last one. Here we're looking at the change in total cost over the change in quantity. And I don't have it in front of me real quick, but actually let me go back on my paper here. Okay, so the first change in cost went from 6,000 to 10,000. So the change there would be 4,000, right? 4,000 over 100 is going to give you 40. The next one was 10 to 12, so it was 2,000. 2,000 over 100 would give you 20. And you can keep doing that. You're going to eventually see that it goes up. It goes down at first, the short run marginal cost curve, and then starts to rise. Graphically, these curves look like this if you then plotted them out. There's your average variable cost, and your average total cost mimics that. Your short run marginal cost, it goes right through the bottom of each curve. You see that? The short run marginal cost intersects the average variable cost at its lowest point. It also intersects the average total cost at its lowest point. So what are they actually saying here? Why are they doing all this? They're trying to prove to you that if you want to have the lowest total costs, you should focus in on your short run marginal cost. What they're trying to prove now is that you should be always focusing in on marginal costs. Just like we said earlier in earlier chapters that you should always be focusing in on setting marginal cost equal to marginal benefit or marginal revenue. Now they're trying to emphasize the importance of focusing in on that for cost minimization as well. So this is just another way of showing the same thing. Once again, you see the short run marginal cost curve intersecting the other cost curves at their lowest point. So now they go into explaining this in the next two slides in words, and I think this gets a little bit more confusing when you talk about it in words. I think it's easier to show it. The average fixed cost decreases continuously as output increases. It's equal to the vertical distance between the average total cost and the average variable cost. The average variable cost is U-shaped. We showed that on the previous slide. It equals the short run marginal cost at the average variable cost minimum. I just told you that the short run marginal cost curve intersects it at its bottom point. The average total cost curve is also U-shaped. It equals the short run marginal cost at the average total cost minimum. I also just mentioned that to you. The short run marginal cost curve is somewhat U-shaped. It kind of resembles a J. It intersects the average variable cost and the average total cost at their minimum points. It lies below the average variable cost and average total cost when the average variable cost and average total cost are falling. And it lies above them when the average variable cost and average total costs are rising. A lot of detail here, I know, but if you look at the pictures, it's easier to follow all this stuff. So what I recommend, if you get a little confused by this, go back to those images we were just looking at, and you'll see that they're just mimicking everything we kind of showed you in those images. Okay, so the relationships between the short run and production costs. This is probably the end, but maybe in some ways, maybe the most important aspect of this chapter. In the case of a single variable input, short run costs are related to the production functions by two relations. These are the relations. So this is a link between product curves and cost curves. So before I get into these relations real quick, I want to stop and say this whole chapter dealt with two things. The first thing it dealt with was production. So it said to you, okay, we can produce a bunch of desks, right? And what's the thing we can vary to produce desks? Do you remember in the short run? Your either capital or labor. What can we vary? You can vary the labor. So one part of the entire chapter was based on, okay, I can add more people to create more desks. That's production. But the other part was costs. So from a producer standpoint, they want to produce as much as they can, but they can't. Why? Because they're held back by their costs, right? So at this juncture in the chapter, they tie the two together, the two things that we discussed, the production and the cost here. So in the case of a single variable input, short run costs are related to the production function by two relations. the average variable cost is going to be equal to your wage. Why wage? Because that's what labor makes over the average product, and the short run marginal cost curve is equal to the wage over the marginal product. So here you're actually talking about the cost curve, you're talking about production, and you're talking about what you're going to pay that input via the wage. So they call W the price of the variable input, but in our case, the variable input's labor, and W basically is wage. Okay, so here you can see that they've tied the two together. They have your average marginal and marginal products on the top curve, and then on the bottom curve you have your marginal and average variable costs. So up top you have product curves, and on the bottom you have cost curves. And you can see that the average product is maximized at C, and the average variable cost is minimized at C. Okay? So that's the major point. That's the point at which you'd want to produce. Okay, so let's move on. When marginal product is increasing, marginal cost is decreasing. When marginal product is decreasing, marginal cost is increasing. When the marginal product equals the average product at the maximum of the average product, marginal cost equals the average variable cost at the minimum of the average variable cost. And that's just what I showed you at the end there, where that's the efficient point to produce. Okay, so this is the end of this chapter. Let me just give me a second in class here. I'm going to try to figure out how to